Hello, 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 ladies and gentlemen. This is an intro to a clip from a long live stream that I did while I was in Africa. A live stream on freedom versus rights versus nature. Freedom versus rights versus nature. One of my first deep dives into political philosophy on this channel, other than my review of Plato's Republic, that is. So I would encourage you to check out the full stream, but this is a clip from there that talks about, I had a conversation with a gentleman that called in that talks about how certain groups coming from a society that emphasizes responsibility really excel when they come into a society that has an infrastructure with an emphasis on rights. Okay? So coming from a society that emphasizes individual responsibility or responsibility vis-a-vis the social group, responsibility vis-a-vis your family, and so on and so forth, coming into a society which is about rights, where, as we know, rights are about what you want, not what you're responsible for, but for what you want. A quick preamble here: rights are about the state of nature as imagined by Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes imagined a state of nature where we say without society it's going to be war of all against all. So John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, okay? The war of all against all. And in that particular situation, what do you want? If I put a gun to your head, what do you want? You don't want to die. You don't want to be imprisoned, and you want the freedom to be able to pursue property, to pursue your ends. Hence we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, it tends not to emphasize responsibility and certain other things. Let's go ahead and enjoy the clip. What you want under duress with a gun to your head, and you say, I want life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. However, these are desires, they're not rational, so on and so forth. It cannot be stopped. Problem number one, who is to, this is a pure imagination, that's number one. Number two, you can have an alternative imagination. And then number three, who is to stop the borders from spilling over? Who is to stop anybody and everybody from claiming all kinds of rights? Okay, and the last thing that I would mention here is that one of my problems with the rights doctrine, the doctrine of rights, universal human rights, which is our God these days. It is our God. When something is completely unquestioned and completely undergirds everything and you don't even see it, it's your God. But there's not an emphasis on responsibility. It just talks about you, what you want. It's all about you. What do you want? But yes, when I have a gun to your head, you're going to be like it's all going to be all about you. Hence, if you have a different view of the state of nature, which could be, let's say, the noble savage view, the noble savage view could actually think, noble savage that is, could actually think, what is my responsibility to the land, the earth, the people, right? Let me get a one in the chat if you understand what I mean by there's no emphasis on responsibility. Rights and responsibility, we know of two sides of the coin, and we talk about the responsibility side tongue in cheek, but this particular construction under which we live is all about rights. It's all about what I want, what I want, what I want, what I want. But of course, that's what it's about, because that's the construction from which it comes. It comes from the state of nature from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. It says, hey, I'm going to put a gun to your head, and what do you want? Okay, and it's not going to talk about your responsibilities. It's not going to talk about what you can actually do. It's not putting you in a position of agency or position of power. It has a gun to your head, and it's asking you what you want. So, we have a guest. Can you go ahead and say something?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Kaizo. So I have a few comments and statements and questions to contribute. Okay, so I do like the seminar today. It's really interesting. I guess some of the comments I have is that it seems it seems as though societies are formulated by three different groups. You have the alphas who lead. You have some of the I guess what you are, which I would guess is more of um, a lone wolf type person that is able to interact in any situation and somehow find out how to win by figuring out the rules of the game. But then you have the majority of people who are more or less following the structures and existing within whatever is created, the domains. So I guess my point here is that uh, it all these concepts about freedom and rights really depend on the culture, because most people don't think high enough in order to demarcate the specifics to actually come up with a worldview that they think in. Most people are operating through some kind of programming that they had been instilled since childhood. So that means basically, I guess I want to tell some people to think more systemic, in a sense that you think in a high level, you create the systems in a higher level framing, and then you allow yourself to then get everyone else who is not able to think at that level to join you. I'll give specific examples, right? In the UK, the data for the most successful ethnicities came out. Usually before this data came out, people had observational evidence that certain ethnicities, I'll name some, Indian people, succeed really well because they work well together in a group level kind of economics spectrum. Now, some people challenged this and said, no, it's just a generalization. But the data clearly shows that Indian people in the UK outperform all of races, and including white people, by twice as much. So I'll link the data in a second with the government website statistics. Now, what this means is that when you have high level people within a community, they're able to create high level games whereby, like you said, you focus on responsibility. The rights already exist, you acknowledge their existence, and you try to operate within the boundary limits of those rights. But you also take responsibility because you acknowledge that whatever cards you're dealt with, your responsibility is to play the best game you can, because that increases your chance of actually winning that game. Because even if you have bad cards, if you bluff it well enough and you play the bluff long enough, you will actually become good at that game. And because you look confident, people will respect you across time. And of course, as you increase the number of participants in this game using that kind of logic, you're going to win across time. So this is just a perfect example of when you have the rights which are already existing, and you don't focus on increasing the rights necessarily, but you focus on operating within the boundary limits of those rights. So that's a perfect example of how a community can succeed even against a so-called institutionally not pristine environment of equality. So, right. And what I've noticed also is that in the Black community especially, there is this sort of mind reprogramming that they want us to not focus on all the right availabilities that we have. For example, again, I'll mention the UK for evidence. There is a school called Michaela Academy. I'll give a link on this. Now, the woman who started this school she's conservative, so not a centrist, but still, she had a theory or a proposition that if she focused on discipline and teaching kids basic stuff like mathematics, arithmetics, English, history, and focusing on discipline, that she would be able to turn the worst performing school in London, where it's majority Black and Asian minority ethnic pupils from very disadvantaged groups without fathers at home, to a very high performing school. Now, people didn't even want her to actually start this school. They really tried to stop her, and it was mostly left-leaning people because they were trying to focus more on the fact that Black people are disenfranchised, rather than focusing on what actual abilities that they can actually do to change their reality. So anyways, long story short is the data for the high school performance of these students came out last year, and guess what? They scored at the top 5% of all schools in the country, including grammar schools, private schools. And this is supposed to be one of the worst areas. I will link the school in the chat in a few minutes. So the point here again is very interesting from your whole thesis is that there is a fine line. Of course, you should never be satisfied with the lack of rights, because that does influence a systemic approach on how you're able, basically the boundary limits that you can operate within. However, at the same time, you should never be at the focal point or at the mercy of those who have that systemic approach, because you still have a three-dimensional sphere that you can move within. You can still move up, down, left, right, and operate within the infinity within that structure that is already existing. And this is evidence and is obvious. So realistically, I guess our point as, higher level men, women, or people generally is we do have that kind of responsibility to create systems that the rest of the community can follow, because unfortunately not everyone can perceive the world in its truest integrity and accept the realities that are harshly existing within the conundrum. You can clearly see this with people who tend to overcome certain traumatic experiences, is that if they are willing to accept the harshness of the reality, and B, willing to accept that they are also the contributor to other people's suffering, right? One of the biggest concepts that I did learn throughout my childhood was that the victim-victimizer dichotomy. We are both the victim at some point and also the victimizer. For example, you have actually turned down some people for sexual advances, the same way some people have turned you down. You have caused internal anguish in other people, the same way they have also caused it in you. This is just an example that people can relate to. But in all circumstances, we are both at the same time, well, I guess it depends how you're going to say it, but at the same situations, different context, we are both. And the issue is many of us are unwilling to accept this fact, and instead we project that we are a victim in a world that is always victimizing us, and it allows us to not see reality in perfection. And I'll give one more example. So right now you have colorism, for example. That's a big issue in many ethnic communities. Now, the interesting thing about colorism is, when I grew up, I noticed that actually a lot of Black people were colorist, and they were very openly colorist. However, when they grew up and then it affected them, is when then they started to realize and try to fight for this movement, because it was only at that point when it became a problem for them. But in the beginning, they themselves were operating within it. And what people do here in these circumstances is they try to create demarcations of differences based on their hierarchy that they're also trying to maintain. So a lot of these women will say that height preferences is different from weight preferences, because height is something that is exclusively applied to male as a disadvantage. Meanwhile, weight is usually on the for women. But you see, they are unwilling to accept, actually, you know what, they are similar. They are both forms of discriminations that exist in nature. And first of all, there's nothing wrong with it in a purely, hedonistic environment, which is what they usually seek. However, at the same time, acknowledging it seems to cause this internal inability, this switch. It's either one, black or white. It's either, yes or no. And that inability to resolve a dichotomy is strenuous. But yeah, in closing, basically, it seems like, everything you're saying is, it's really, really super interesting. And it does seem like there is a responsibility for us who can perceive the system and see beyond it, to actually work to create systems that are better functioning, so that we can fix communities. Because at the end of the day, not everybody would understand the message that you've espoused at the level that you have actually espoused it at. People will take it at different levels.
I have a question for you before as you know, you said a lot, right?
Okay.
So, but just one thing you said there, the message I espoused. What message did you hear?
Okay, right, I see. The message that I heard is that, well, I guess the message that I heard is that acknowledging all it's okay. I heard the technical aspect of the message, which is the way you've demarcated the differences between rights, responsibilities, left-leaning, right-leaning, and how the whole system as a whole functions to maintain an equilibrium, which means that one side or the other doesn't completely create a chaotic system that doesn't function. It's like a bird. If one wing is smaller than the other, the bird will be unable to move in the correct velocity at the correct distance, because it will be pulled one side more than the other and rotate in circles. So that's the kind of more of the technical aspect of the of it. However, I've also taken on further as that, like I said, those who can perceive the whole system we all each have responsibilities at the different levels of understandings that we have garnered to self-improve ourselves, but also the community, if obviously that is something that we value.
Are you a community-minded organizer, politician type of person?
I could be, but my issue is I find it hard to work with people if I don't have the complete power to make movements, because it becomes difficult to reason when my ideas aren't taken as seriously as they should be.
Hmm. 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 Interesting, because I liked in the very beginning your categorization where you said people with power, the masses, and then you mentioned, okay, I may be just some kind of lone wolf type. Yes, which I am. As I said, I like to categorize myself as more of a creative type, which you call it whatever you want. I do certain creative things, and in this particular regard, it's philosophy, right? Which is the same kind of thing. And as Plato's Republic kind of suggests, the philosopher and the politician tend to be two very different kinds of people, right? But let me get into a few of the things that you mentioned here, which are they're very interesting, because you talk about different communities, right, that come into a society whereby you have this system of Western liberal democracy and rights, and then you tend to find that certain outsiders benefit more. And as you mentioned it, now the story is well known and ubiquitous and so on and so forth. In America, we have our own kind of totem pole of, the most successful ethnic groups and so on and so forth. But something that came to mind when you mentioned it is, when you brought up the responsibility aspect, I'm like, these people are perhaps taking advantage of the best of both worlds, if you know what I mean. They're coming into a society where rights exist, a certain infrastructure of rights exists, but they're coming equipped with a high level of emphasis on responsibility, right? So it's almost like they come in already fully equipped with responsibility, and then they can take full advantage of the right stuff. And hence you don't tend to hear these people complain about, I don't have enough rights, or I don't have enough equality here. They're like, what are you talking about? Like, this is a gold mine. I could totally kill it out here, right? So many immigrant groups coming into the West, especially coming from a particular culture that highly emphasize education, the Indians, for example, or let's say the Nigerians in America, for example, or the Koreans and so on, certain Asian groups, high emphasis on education, high emphasis on responsibility, coming in and then taking advantage of a society where there's rights, and they don't feel the need to be like, oh, I need to push for more and more rights. This is great. I can just come here and exercise my responsibility, and they tend not to understand to use a provocative word, the privilege that they have, right?
Right.
And I say that tongue in cheek. There is a privilege that one has when one comes in. I'm an immigrant, for example, to the United States from Nigeria. And I know that I have a privilege in that regard, whereby I have no need to feel like I need any more rights or any more freedoms or need to complain about anything whatsoever. I'm just here to execute and try to execute at the highest level. So that was rather interesting. And then you mentioned the thing about the school, which there is something about a society which is kind of heavily based on rights, and the rights from the perspective of from where they came from, right? Which is the rights of, what do you desire? It tends to then, and democracy too, which is something else. Democracy is a system which creates a certain kind of person as well. Okay, different societies they don't necessarily create, but they emphasize a particular aspect of the human soul, if you will. And then in order to operate in that society, so the democratic man is a different kind of man from the aristocratic man living in an aristocratic society. So democratic societies tend to then push for a democratic personality and self-esteem, and that plays to your school part. These people, whether consciously or not, okay, whether it's conscious or not, I'm not sure, but they rather than go with what this lady suggested, right, which is I'm going to just go with discipline, if you will, okay, and I'm going to pick these disciplines, reading, writing, arithmetic, whatever it is, and that with these I will be able to turn it around. These other people are actually more concerned with things like self-esteem and a democratic personality and everybody feeling heard or feeling good. And to be provocative, I'm going to say certain kind of female value systems. Yes,
Right.
yes, yes. I'm being provocative, right? But not so much provocative, because I already kind of explained in the beginning of the talk why or establish that there are differences in the male and female psychology, and that it makes more sense. These differences are pronounced very much in the extremes, and society and things change in the margins. And if you're gonna have, and we know that women are the ones that are more concerned with everybody feeling heard, at ease, part of the group, so on and
Right.
so forth, and that the rights doctrine and democracy and liberal democracy in general tends to then sway more and more and more and more towards that side of things, whereby rather than just say, hey, give them the discipline, it's like, no, 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 no. Again, I'm not sure it's actually conscious on their part, because
I
I
have
don't. Go
right.
ahead.
I have actually an interesting explanation from my own thesis about this circumstance. So at first, initially, I thought to myself, do they secretly want us to fail? Right, because of course some would, but I don't think that's the majority of them. I think majority of them is, as you said, it's what they do is they formulate. Okay, so from my own thesis is that I found that feminine-based abstractions are more qualitative, and then masculine-based abstractions are more quantitative. So masculine abstractions want to figure out to what extent feminine abstractions wants to figure out, is it true or is it not? For example, even if statistically black males committed more crime, they would still say, no, that's not a good argument, because you can't generalize, because you might make mistakes and you harm individual people's lifestyles and abilities to move within a society, because then that stereotype would then be used to reinforce that negation and then prevent social mobility. So they focus on the qualitative aspect. Meanwhile, masculine frames usually focus on the quantitative. However, bad masculine abstractions doesn't quantify correctly. So they quantify incorrectly. That's where you get the conservative types that formulate these so-called overgeneralizations. Meanwhile, the feminine abstraction of qualitative arguments don't make good qualitative arguments. They make qualitative arguments of not necessarily. But the thing is, everything is a not necessarily case. There's actually nothing that is exclusive or can be true at all cases, right?
Yeah.
We know this from philosophy. There is no apart from like mathematical objects, nothing is all inclusive every single time. I can't even say humans have two legs. Sometimes they don't. I can't say black people have dark skin. In your case, you don't. So there is no all-inclusive argument. So they make their rebuttals to arguments is from a not all perspective, which is false, because there is no such thing as an all-inclusive argument. And then, like I said, the masculine frame, the more right, super right side, is based on bad quantitative markers that then overgeneralize and can't accept the exceptions, or even want to kind of demarcate specifically. For example, like in America, you said Nigerian immigrants do extremely well, almost as well as the Indian immigrants. In the UK, Nigerians actually perform some of the best in schools. Again, they also make a lot of money if you break down black into different ethnicities. So the quantitative marker is when you overgeneralize, create pseudo quantitative markers that then the other side kind of see that doesn't actually make sense. Now, but in terms of what you said about do they care or not, yes, I do agree with you. It is an esteem-based abstraction. So when we get more rights, humans are more concerned about their own ego, and by ego I mean sense of self. Because we're all playing hierarchical games and structures, because that's what all life is. People want to feel valued, that their being is valued in the system. And like you said, this goes into everything. For example, there's a woman I saw a TikTok video making a video. She's overweight and she's not so attractive, from an objective perspective. She made a video saying, I wish I was traditionally or objectively beautiful just to experience how it is like for men to find me attractive. All the men I have dated is only from online and only because of my personality. Now, every woman on that chat was saying, you're beautiful, don't worry about this. They're trying to improve my self-esteem, but that's not what she wants. She
Yeah.
wishes she could be beautiful. Now, I said to her, if you lost weight, you went to the gym, you became this size, you put on some makeup, you actually did something to your hair, she would be a 7 out of 10. But I was being accused, I was being hated on for giving her the solution to her problem. This is literally what you know, with the school thing situation is there is an actual solution to the problem, but they're more concerned at uprooting the more fundamental problem of nature, which is so difficult to uproot. You can't just make everyone find overweight people who don't have their makeup done the right way attractive. You can't recalibrate very, very primitive responses to human nature. But they believe that they can, and that belief is outweighed by the evidence. And like you said, it's a self-esteem, ego manifestation issue. It's a hierarchy. It's a hierarchy based abstraction. They want to feel as though their natural way of being is valued in the system that is created.
Yeah. And how old are you, by the way, if you don't mind me asking?
All right. I'm 28.
You're not married, are you? No.
Yeah, no.
Okay. So, just saying that a little tongue-in-cheek in a jocular mood there, because you talked about giving solutions. You already know where I'm going with that. Solutions are not what is wanted.
Right, exactly.
One solutions. It's a really hard thing for me to, and I'm gonna get a little personal in terms of for me, because even if it's just this talk, if you listen to me in general. I tend to err heavily on that kind of, I'm going to overgeneralize that there is no but what if or not necessarily, and very, very, almost that conservative caricature that you painted. And it's very hard for me to understand the self-esteem based aspects of, or point of view, let's say, wanting to feel heard, wanting to be validated, and so on and so forth. Because I have an ego like anyone else, right? But I'm not, and I'm just kind of, it's a stream of consciousness now. I haven't thought about what I'm saying. You just, as you say stuff, I'm just thinking about this. Like, the ego thing that you mentioned is very important. Is very important, and I have also heard it in other recent either books or things I've been listening to, vis-a-vis this kind of an ego that wants the validation. Let's just call it the female ego versus the male ego, and because I'm thinking like, I'm an egotistical bastard, so how come I don't understand that kind of ego?
Right.
And for me, the answer for me almost seems even a little bit more egotistical, which is more like, for me, my ego wants to be completely self-generated. Like, there is no ego in me being validated. That will be me doing the vanity thing, which I kind of completely separate from it. I'm like, yes, my ego, my grounding, myself. And then I can then go out there and peacock or whatever, right? But it's very different. That's not ego. That's just vanity and peacocking and, hey, look at me. But that's a very fragile from my point of view. And but to the point about balance and understanding the different kinds of people, especially not just from a societal point of view, but if you're going to be in any kind of an intimate relationship with a woman, not to mention marriage and then family, I'm talking to myself now.
Right.
I have to really work on this kind of thing where I need to really learn, for example, that solutions are not what is needed. And that listening a lot of times and validation is all that is required. And I should learn not to think that their ego gratification is being pursued for the same reasons or will be satisfied in the same ways that mine will be, if any of that makes sense.
No, it makes it makes perfect sense, because I guess it's based on how we evolved independently to some extent, and dependently in some extent. So
Mm,
if we turn into a simple hunter gatherer, men usually were the ones hunting, and when they came back, they would want to eat more meat than everybody else, because the job is dangerous. They risk life because an animal could kill you. Now the women would have preferred that everyone had the equal share of the meat, regardless if they were hunting or gathering the fruits, because to them it's more everyone needs to eat something. But to us, we're more focused on the competition, the risk involved. We quantify things a bit more. So even when we're protecting them, for example, what I realized, I asked my friend this question before I demarcated a bit more, is there's a difference between being insecure and feeling insecure. Because
mm,
you can be insecure in a relationship when you really can't see your partner is espousing strange or irregular behavioral patterns. You're
mm,
insecure from a point of fact. That relationship
mhm,
is not secure, like a door that is not locked at night in a dangerous environment. You're
mhm,
not secure. It's not about how you feel. It is a
mhm,
point of fact that it's an insecure environment. Then
mhm,
there is the feeling of insecure, which can happen even if you live in Malibu with a crime rate of 0%. If you
mhm,
don't feel secure in that environment, you won't be able to satisfy your ego, as you said before. So for them,
mhm,
they value more the feeling of security
mhm,
rather than the actuality of security.
mhm.
Of course, they would prefer if they had both, but if you press them on a particular focus, it'll be the feeling rather than the actuality.
Yeah, it is. It is an interesting conundrum that one finds oneself in, and the question of how much you actually can do in terms of what you actually should do, what you can do, and the fact that you cannot intellectualize these things away. In other
No.
words, you're not going to sit down and then say, "Look here, this is what I want. Here's what you want. Here's oh, yeah, here's let's laugh over the graph of what we do and what we don't do."
No.
That doesn't work. Plus, there's another kind of interesting thing about relationships, of this particular kind, right? You know, intimate relationships, which let's just go all the way to like marriage, and why it's particularly difficult because some people would, you say, oh, well, want to marry your best friend and all these things. Even if you marry your best friend, here's the big difference between your best friend and your wife. Okay, you can have a okay. Let me not even paint the context, but you can go for weeks without talking to your best friend, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it's fine. Okay, you may have all kinds of reasons why you didn't talk to your best friend. You may actually be a little pissed off at him. Maybe you had too much of this guy or girl or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Or you guys argued about Kobe versus LeBron, and there was a big blowout at the bar or something, and then you're like, I'm going to cool off this person for a couple weeks, but you can't do that in a marriage, right? Okay,
No.
you're not sleeping in the same bed with your best friend. So that's why, just purely from a practical standpoint, not having to do with whether the added difficulties of the differences in psychological makeup, right? But
Right.
just from a purely practical standpoint, it is very difficult because you cannot do what you do with your best friend or do what you do with employer, employee, or coworkers, or it is completely different. It's it's not like anything else. Another thing that you mentioned was the victimizer, or the oppressor aspect, which is something that I've always kind of been acutely aware of, in the sense that um, I don't know. Maybe it's the point of view of, okay, not wanting to feel like a victim, right? I don't want to feel
Right.
like a victim. I don't want to ever complain. So that may be a particular bias. Okay, fine. I have that bias. But that leads me to, and perhaps it's a rationalization of the bias, that very quickly leads me to understanding that we are all equally oppressor and oppressed, depending on which particular parameter you choose and depending on what particular time you want to use, right? And
Right.
I think Jordan Peterson is the one who tends to point it out this way, which is, in terms of victim groups, or what is their word? The word that they use for intersectionality.
Yeah.
Yes, intersectionality, that the ultimate intersectional victim is the individual. And he has this kind of mathematical way of looking at it, where if you pick a certain number of dimensions of oppression, right?
Hmm.
uh, you're going to end up just ending up at one person, at the individual,
Yeah.
right? Because yeah, and it's best to, it's kind of an interesting way, and one might say, oh, you were just an individualist to begin with, and that's why you that's why you made that kind of an argument, which is fine. I have no issues, by the way, and as I've mentioned throughout, I have no issues with the idea of psychological predispositions being the reasons for why we have certain positions, and then we may do some post hoc rationalization, and that's fine. It does not invalidate my psychological predisposition, and
Mm.
it does not make my position wrong from the point of view of the type of person that I am in society, plus also from the point of view of the role that particular, because I tend to juxtapose society and individuals, because I think that we all have all these different sides of ourselves. Otherwise, we will not be able to understand, right? So we do have a side of ourselves that understands the need for fairness and wanting to share the meat equally, right?
Right.
Otherwise, we would not even know what that meant, right? So, but the point is that part of us is a valid part of us in whichever domain that it plays a role in our lives, right? For some of us, we don't use that, or we don't play in that area as much, but same thing with the whole of society. You're not going to expect that there's going to be a society without those people who emphasize more greatly that aspect of themselves, right? So the whole thing about the individual, and again, it's like, okay, you're an egotistical bastard. You're an individualist to begin with. You probably have some delusions of grandeur or whatever the hell it is, and that's why you're saying all these things. I'm willing to accept all that, but from a purely objective standpoint, if you start looking at all the different, okay, you're male, you're black, you're this, you're that, you're all these different ways in which you can try to form groups, you're just going to end up at the individual, okay? And then
Yeah.
what is this going to be, the war of all individuals against all other individuals? We are all oppressor, and like there's an example that somebody likes to give, like, hey, you know what, like, I'd rather be a black guy than a ugly fat white guy with a
Yeah.
bad acne problem,
Yeah.
right?
Even without acting.
It's like, yeah, really bad acne and fat and ugly short white guy. Would you rather be a black guy than that guy?
Yeah.
And if you're honest, I think some people would say, yeah. And I don't even think we have to really go that extreme, especially in 2020.
Yeah.
And again, I'm just talking from my perspective, perhaps. And again, I'm an immigrant and so on and so forth. And I grew up the way I grew up, and I have my particular privileges, as we said earlier. So, yeah, this is, I think that you said a lot of good stuff there. Did you have any questions or anything?
Yeah. So okay. Okay. So before I make the question, I'll make a short comment about what you said about the practical aspect of a relationship. For me, what I've realized is that um, a lot of women actually want you to take leadership position implicitly and do what you need to do, at the same time validating them. So they want you to basically be the puppet string leader who does make all the difficult choices and safety measures, but they also want you to give them the daily affirmation. So they want you to play the puppet and the father at the same time. At the same time, telling them that they're empowered, they're independent, but they just don't want to acknowledge that you actually ultimately are the puppet's string leader. So that's what I found is the one that works the most, and is I mean, I actually do have a fiance.
Hmm.
I went to Africa to find her because I wanted an environment of people who aren't as broken to some of these rights kind of mentality concepts. I wanted someone who might understand something from a similar way. I'm also an immigrant to the
Hmm.
UK, so like I said, we have a certain perspective about reality that native people of certain rights-based abstractions don't quite have intrinsically. So, and yeah, the question I have is, so what do you think is your role for, especially for yeah, for young men. Yeah. So what sort of do you think that you have a responsibility to not just teach, but to teach them in a way that will actually allow many of them to find. Okay, so what I mean is,
Mhm.
you can teach in a way where you teach, but you're not so focused on whether that teaching is actualized, or you can teach in a way that you really do want change to actually manifest itself. So which one are you?
Okay, so we are all fairly opaque to ourselves, or to put it in the negative way, we are not transparent to ourselves, right? That's like just a basic truth, right? So in
Right,
terms of our motivations and so on and so forth, that I would state as fact number one. Fact number two, which is that I am not a particularly strategic person. Okay,
right,
I've said, I'm kind of intuitive, creative type, right?
right,
Having said those things, let's look at the objective reality. Okay, the objective reality is I'm over here on YouTube, uh, talking about these ideas, right? And sharing certain things and saying that I like to share things in particular. And this goes to your point about you could teach, but do you want it to, let's just say, actionable, right? Things that you teach it in a way where these things can be manifested in the real world. I would say that yes, I